Welcome to the scientific method presentation. During this presentation, you will learn more about how scientists design their experiments and collect their data. Scientists follow the scientific method, which is a logical approach to solving problems or answering questions. The key word in this definition is the word logical. No good science experiment is ever random or haphazard. Instead, scientists make very deliberate choices when deciding how they will carry out their tests. The scientific method is also a dynamic process. Sometimes a scientist will get to the end of an experiment and find out that the results are not anything like what they expected. That doesn't mean that this is a failed experiment. This might point the scientist in new directions or could even open up new avenues of scientific research. The scientific method relies on conducting controlled experiments. A controlled experiment tests only one change at a time. By only varying one thing at a time, the scientists can be sure that the results that they're seeing are attributable to that one change. If the scientist tried to change 2 or even 3 things at a time, the scientist would have no way of knowing which thing had the largest effect on the results. So therefore, scientists pick one thing that they are changing at a time. At the beginning of the experiment, the scientists will typically make a hypothesis, which is their best guess. This is often given as an if-then statement. A sample hypothesis might be if I said, if a plant receives 6 hours of sunlight per day, then it will grow taller than a plant that only receives 2 hours of sunlight per day. That would be a testable hypothesis that was my best guess about what results I expected from the experiment. Good record keeping is always important in science. Scientists are very careful to keep accurate records. That way, at the end of the experiment, they can publish their data and share it with others. Lastly, the scientific method typically involves performing multiple trials of the same experiment. By doing the experiment several times, the scientists can be sure that the results that they're getting are consistent. This slide contains some vocabulary words related to the scientific method. Variables are the things that have an effect on the results of the experiment. The independent variable is the variable that is changed or manipulated by the scientist. We've already said that in a good experiment, scientists are only making one change at a time. So the thing that the scientist has control over is your independent variable. The dependent variable is exactly what it sounds like. It depends on the independent variable. The dependent variable can be thought of as the response that is made. As one thing changes, so that would be the independent variable that the scientist manipulated, then there will be some response that the scientist is measuring. That response is the dependent variable. Lastly, all good experiments involve controls. These are quantities that the scientist wants to remain constant and unchanging throughout the experiment. Here is a list of the 5 basic steps of the scientific method. It's important to note that these are the basic steps, this is the norm, but not all experiments are going to follow these exact steps in this exact order. Every experiment is different and scientists will adjust accordingly. But to give you a basic idea of how things typically run, the first step is that the scientists will identify the problem to be solved or the question to be answered. Scientists start off by identifying one specific problem that they can test. The second step is to make observations about what you already know. Typically for a scientist, this would involve reading widely about the topic and finding out what other experiments have already been done related to that topic. The third step is to formulate a testable hypothesis. Again, the hypothesis is the scientist's best guess about what will happen during the experiment. The fourth step is often the most difficult. the scientist must design and carry out a controlled experiment. Typically, the scientist will write out a procedure, which can be written in paragraph form or as a numbered list. The procedure is a very specific list of all the steps that the scientist takes throughout the experiment. Procedures are very detailed. That way, another scientist could come along and do the same experiment and replicate the same results. During the experiment, the scientist will collect data, and that data will be used in the last step of the scientific method. The last step is to draw conclusions based on the data. The scientist will decide if the data supports or refutes the hypothesis. Here are two words that we often think of as being interchangeable, but they are not. So I wanted to put a slide in here telling you the difference between a theory and a natural law. A theory can also be called a model, and this is a set of well-tested hypotheses that give an overall explanation or explain why. For example, the Big Bang Theory is our overall explanation of how the universe formed. But a theory is not able to be proven. For example, with the Big Bang Theory, we weren't around at the time of the Big Bang. There is no way for us to recreate that particular moment in time. So it's a good theory, it's a great overall explanation that explains what we know, but it is not able to be proven. The natural law, or a scientific law, is a summary of results. Scientific laws come about when the same observation applies to many different systems. So an example here would be the law of conservation of mass, which you'll see throughout this course. The law of conservation of mass says that during an experiment, no matter is ever lost or gained. It just changes form, meaning that matter doesn't disappear into the ether. It does have to go somewhere. Even if it changes from a liquid to a gas that we can no longer see, that doesn't mean that the matter disappeared. So because we've seen these same results over all areas of science, chemistry, physics, biology, we say that the law of conservation of mass is a summary statement of our results. Let's walk through a scientific method scenario. You need to be able to read a scenario, and you need to be able to pick out the independent variable, the dependent variable, and the controls during that experiment. So here's a sample scenario. The Strong Mint Company has created a secret ingredient for a breath mint that will cure bad breath. So they're developing this new thing. They hope it's going to work, but they've decided to test it. They have asked 100 customers with a history of bad breath to come in and try the new breath mint. Of those 100 people, they're going to divide the people into two groups. The company asked 50 customers, who we will call Group A, to eat a breath mint after they finished a meal containing garlic and onions. The other 50 people, who we will call Group B, also received a breath mint after their meal. They were told that the breath mint had the secret ingredient in it, but it was just a regular breath mint. No secret ingredient involved. Both Group A and Group B were told that the breath mint they got was going to cure their bad breath because of this new secret ingredient. 2 hours after eating the meal, 32 customers in Group A and 14 customers in Group B reported having better breath than they normally would have. So my first question to you is, which people are in the control group? And if we look back at this scenario, hopefully you can see that Group B would be the control group. They're getting the normal conditions. We have not tested the secret ingredient on them. You always want to have a control group in your experiment because it provides a basis of comparison. So we can compare the results from Group B to the results of Group A, who did get the secret ingredient. So Group B would be our control group in this scenario. So if we look at the same scenario again, we can ask ourselves, what is the independent variable? What do the experimenters actually change? And the independent variable here is the secret ingredient. The experimenters are changing that some people got the secret ingredient, some people did not get the secret ingredient. So the secret ingredient is what the researchers have control over. They've divided the people into group B, which was our control group, and they've divided the people into group A, which was our experimental group. So whether someone got the ingredient or not, that's the independent variable. That's the factor being tested and changed. The dependent variable. Remember that the dependent variable is the response to the independent variable. So in this particular scenario, the response is the people's breath, the amount of odor that they believe their breath has. After the meal, they ask everyone, group A and group B, whether they felt like they had better breath than normal. They asked them, did they feel like this breath mint worked for them? So the response is the people's opinion about their breath. What conclusions can the company draw? Well, looking at their data, 32 people in Group A and 14 people in Group B thought they had better breath. Group A are the people that got the breath mint. We could probably conclude that the secret ingredient in the breath mint does seem to work, but it's not 100% effective, since not all 50 people felt like it worked for them. And lastly, one thing to mention is, why do you think that 14 people in Group B reported better breath even though they did not get the secret ingredient? This is called the placebo effect. When people are told that they are getting a cure, they believe it in their mind, and sometimes they believe that they see results, even though there is no scientific basis or logical reason for them to see results. So Group B is reporting a placebo effect in those 14 people who felt that this had worked better for them than normal. So hopefully that little scenario will help you be able to pick out the experimental group, the control group, the independent variable, and the dependent variable in any science experiment. Just remember that the independent variable is the thing that the researcher changes, and the dependent variable is the response to that change.